We're here in Geneva, in Switzerland, at the Overcoming Inequalities in a Fractured World conference hosted by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development.
I had the pleasure to speak with some of the speakers. Enjoy this mini-series about inequalities.
My name is Jomo Kwame Sundaram, and I live in Malaysia. I used to teach economics in the university, and then I worked for about 11 years in the United Nations system, overseeing economic and social development research, first in New York for 7.5 years, and then at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome for 3.5 years.
Thank you so much for joining me here on Skype. We met at the conference Overcoming Inequalities in a Fractured World, where you participated at the roundtable Engines of Inequalities, Elites, Politics and Power. How did we arrive at this moment in which the richest 1% of the population holds half of the world's wealth?
Well, I think from what the data tells us, especially about income, inequalities have grown a great deal, especially in the last 2 centuries, since the time of the Industrial Revolution and the change of the type of imperialism. And this has very important implications. What basically has happened is that a huge gap grew between those economies which successfully made the transition to either industry or very highly productive agriculture, such as the so-called settler colonies of the British Empire, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and so on. This gap has been extremely important, but in the last century or so, there have been some important developments. We find, for example, that after the First World War, during the 1920s, and there was a continued huge increase in inequality, but also in economic vulnerability. This led to the crash and the depression, particularly during the 1930s. At that time, there were a number of measures which were taken in the United States, which we often refer to as the New Deal, but also in other parts of the world to get the support of their publics behind them. An extreme type of ethno-populism, which we often call fascism, developed in countries such as Germany, in Italy, and Japan, of course. But there were also other sympathetic tendencies in other parts of the world, such as Spain and so on. But before that, there was a very strong reaction to these growing inequalities, most successful reaction against it in the form of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And then slowly, over time, there were other revolutions, but many of the subsequent revolutions which took place were also wars of national liberation. And this, I think, is very important to recognize. What happened, for example, in China, and later on in other countries such as Vietnam, were really wars of national liberation. So these all responded to different types of inequalities. And these different types of inequalities at that time were used by certain forces to mobilize around what was called socialism and so on. And then there was another type of reaction against inequalities. The inequalities among the rich world between the established imperial powers, colonial powers, and the rising ones, such as Germany and Japan and so on. And this could not be resolved. And it eventually led to the Second World War. During the Second World War, many people were mobilized for the war effort, and especially women. Women were mobilized because men were often the main people in the war, and so much of the rest of the economy including the household economy, was sustained by women. So after the end of the Second World War, it was not, you just could not simply go back to the status quo ante. You had to organize life differently. And for about a quarter of a century after 1945, there were quite a number of reforms which were used to be called, referred to as part of the welfare state. And these were reforms to try to reduce the inequalities of the century since the Industrial Revolution, before the Depression. Most of the time when we talk about inequalities, we think about national level inequalities, and this is especially true in the West. But for many others in the rest of the world, they are not only thinking about the inequalities in their own societies, but they are also very conscious of the fact that they have been left behind, they have been marginalized by the way society has changed. And if you look at total inequality in the world today, about 2/3 of it is due to differences among countries, and about 1/3 are differences of so-called class. So these differences, if you describe them as differences of location or geography versus class, you can begin to understand why so many people want to move. They see movement, migration, international migration included, as a way of overcoming their own economic insecurity and economic deprivations. Of course, there are many other reasons as well, but this is extremely important. What has changed, however, is that in the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been a very important change, that we found that in some parts of the developing countries, you began to see, maybe not 2 or 3 decades ago, even half a century ago, you began to see accelerated economic growth. First initially in places like Korea and Taiwan and so on, but also spreading to other countries in East Asia. And then from the end of the 20th century, there seems to be accelerated growth even in the southern cone of Latin America. And from the beginning of the 21st century, accelerated growth in some countries in Africa, because there was greater demand for the things Africa could produce, especially minerals, but also some agricultural production. And the demand was not coming from the West. The new demand was coming from the East, from China, from India, and so on. So all this has significantly changed the world. So even though the initial motivation for what is called globalization was for the big corporations of the North to make more profits from controlling more and more economic resources all over the world, that whole process has had unexpected consequences, including the fact that many countries have been able to grow much more than ever before, and some of this growth has trickled down, including to workers, and especially where the workers and the farmers have been able to secure rights, their incomes have often gone up. So we have a world which has changed quite a lot. And then, of course, we have seen, especially during the last decade, much slower economic growth in the West and also in Japan. And all this has meant that the gap between the North and the South has been reduced a little bit, but at the same time, in many countries, both in the North and the South, inequalities at the national level have increased. So it's a very complex picture about how the world has been changing. But I think it's important to remember that geography means a lot and class continues to mean a lot. And the interactions between the two are not very straightforward. So globalization, for example, the reaction to globalization is quite complex. So, for example, in in the West, everybody benefits from cheaper products which are made in poor countries with very low wages for the workers and so on and so forth. Everybody benefits from the cheaper products. But when people lose their jobs or their working conditions become worse because the employers and the big corporations have alternatives abroad, they do not feel it all at the same time. So the resistance to this very complex processes of globalization and economic liberalization more generally used to be quite uneven and quite slow. But recently, 1 decade of very poor economic performance, especially in the West, has resulted in all kinds of reactions. Some progressive, some reactionary, and generally there has been a tendency to blame the other, to blame the outsider. The outsider in terms of somebody who's culturally different, who's alien, who looks different or behaves differently, and also to blame the rest of the world, other countries, especially those who are different culturally and so on. So what we have is a situation where the opposition to economic liberalization is bigger than ever before. But it is also includes very many reactionary forces in addition to the progressive forces who oppose globalization almost from the outset. So in many ways you can see, due to the transformation of the economy, the transformation of social relations, and the transformation of politics in the post-colonial world.
In the economic system we have today, it seems that in order to have winners, we need losers. Can we change it? How?
In our society today, it is quite possible to have economic growth which is shared. If you look, for example, at China has been growing, and real incomes for working people have been going up. But unfortunately, China is the exception. China is the only country where you have this kind of very clear a rising tide lifting all boats. Of course, there are some very ridiculous multi-billionaires in China as well. But the high growth rate has enabled this phenomenon to take place in China. And in different times in society, this has happened in many other parts of society. If you think about Northern Europe, for example, even to today, Norway, despite being one of the richest countries in the world, is also one of the most egalitarian societies in the world. So, but these two countries, China on the one hand and Norway on the other, are almost exceptional. Most countries, we see the rich growing at the expense of the poor. One cannot deny that one of the benefits of so-called globalization were cheaper consumer goods for many people in the West. Okay? And for the producers, the workers who are producing those goods, who didn't have jobs before, they benefited from getting some jobs, some steady income. It is very low, very, very low, especially when compared to the West. But it was probably higher than before. You find that in countries like Bangladesh or even in Ethiopia, people are getting better off. But again, these are exceptions. And the way in which the West particularly, but also Japan, responded to the last great so-called great financial crisis, global financial crisis in 2008-2009, mainly using so-called unconventional monetary policies. Firstly, those policies are very blunt. They can benefit all kinds of people, but the way the policies were implemented, it really helped the rich to become even richer. So the concentration not of income but of wealth, especially in the United States. The United States is one of the more successful examples of recovery compared to Europe during this period. But there has been a far greater concentration of wealth. So very often when we talk about economic inequality, we mix up the two, income and wealth. And income is a flow and wealth is a stock. It's important for us to recognize this. So the availability of cheap credit, or what they call easy credit, enabled the people who could borrow to borrow very cheap and to buy up wealth from other people who were distressed. And the result is this far greater concentration of wealth in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. And so this is part of the reason why there is so much alienation and resentment, but also, unfortunately, misunderstanding.
We do not have the resources to make everyone as wealthy as a billionaire. Neither do we have the resources to live as the rich are doing. We do not have sufficient resources on our planet to sustain such a lifestyle. How do you feel about this?
Well, to put it in terms of a slogan, we have enough for everybody's needs, but not for everybody's greed. And this is a slogan associated with Gandhi, but possibly it was there even before Gandhi. But I think the message is quite clear. No, you're quite right, and this is a dynamic which we have in our society. But some of the recent technological developments are accelerating this process, and part of these processes, part of the problem, of course, is that there is a very weak sense of social solidarity, and some of the people who are able to organize social solidarity do so on a reactionary basis. So this is a very major problem, and unless you can organize an alternative, successfully organize and sustain an alternative, we are in very, very serious trouble. As far as the problems of resources are concerned, I mean, the challenge is that it's not simply, as many people like to say, the population, human population is growing and so on and so forth. Part of the problem is that we are taking resources from the earth without thinking about sustainability. And we are also, in the process of human consumption, producing a lot of side effects which are not going to go away, which are reducing the quality of life, increasing pollution, and so on, more greenhouse gases and so on, all of which are going to have adverse effects not only for ourselves but for future generations. But unfortunately, it's not easy to organize solutions. Part of the problem is that everybody wants to have what they call so-called win-win solutions, so that the people will benefit, but also the businesses will benefit. And of course, there are some such options, but very often business is most interested in promoting solutions which will benefit themselves. And the benefit to society is a secondary consideration. So there are not many occasions when the two coincide. And so it is very difficult in our society, which is becoming increasingly individualistic.
At the conference, you spoke about capitalism and the near future. What options do we have?
Well, what I was saying at the conference is that in the near future, capitalism is the only show in town. There's no immediate alternative to capitalism. The anti-capitalist forces are not strong. Okay, so, however, what I was also saying is that there are varieties of capitalism. What is happening in China today, or what is happening in Norway, is not anti-capitalist. It's different type of management of capitalism. And likewise with Bangladesh, they are not some other type of society, but they have learned to moderate capitalism. They have learned to manage capitalism, just as Roosevelt tried to do during the 1930s. Roosevelt was not a socialist. And during the 1940s, when various reforms were taking place in Western Europe, 40s and 50s and so on, these reforms have helped improve conditions, reduce the worst inequalities. But to say that that was the end of capitalism, I think would be a great exaggeration. Of course, there are some right-wing libertarians who think any time there is a role for government, that is the end of capitalism. Of course, that kind of simplistic thinking is becoming quite popular. But leaving that aside, I think there are varieties of capitalism, and what people will need to think about is also how we can mobilize some of those forces to do some good. Let me give you a simple example. During the time I was working in the United Nations, we proposed the idea of a global Green New Deal. So we wanted to capture the idea of Roosevelt, a new deal with certain responsibilities of not only for the workers but also for the capitalists and so on, including paying taxes and so on. But in addition, we recognize the challenges of sustainability which we face in the world, the resource depletion and exhaustion, the continued destruction of the environment, destruction of the basis for continued existence on Earth. And also we raised the question, we said that because of the huge inequalities in the world today, this has to be inequalities which are going to be dealt with are not just at a national level, but also global. That's why the very clumsy slogan of a global Green New Deal. And we propose specifically that we have a golden opportunity. This is 10 years ago, right? The golden opportunity to reduce poverty, especially what we call energy poverty, in the South by a massive subsidization of electricity from renewable energy sources in the South. And much of this was conceived of as solar. Some of it, of course, could have been from other sources, wind turbines and so on. At that time, we thought that the unit costs were coming down, but not coming down fast enough. There was a need to subsidize electrification in the South. You cannot rely on existing demand because they are very poor people who do not have the resources to buy electricity at market rates, especially if you start introducing things like carbon taxes and all that without thinking about the distributional implications. So that was our proposal. But unfortunately, because of this idea of independent power producers generating electricity and that the government should not be involved in producing electricity and so on, what we find is that business interests have become so powerful and very, very powerful lobbies which are misleading governments, misleading publics about the real options. So I think we have a situation where we can actually move quite rapidly to renewable energy. So this was part of the proposal to think about how to deal with an economic crisis in terms of changing the social relations. It was not going to be the end of capitalism, okay, to be sure. But it would have been, if successful, we would have seen many people who have never had access to modern electricity would be able to have access to modern electricity and to be able to improve their conditions of life. for example, to use mechanical power to overcome the drudgery of certain types of manual labor, or to use electricity for cooking instead of certain fossil fuels, or to use electricity for studying for children. All this could have been made possible. So we should not say that the only thing is to end capitalism, but we need to begin to think about how we can improve things if the economic system does not fundamentally change. How do we manage it better so that we do not destroy the very basis for our own futures and existence?
What could or should be done to initiate progressive change?
I don't think there are any universal answers. There are no universal answers. I think those days when people thought in terms of a single force, with a very clear blueprint for everybody, is no longer there. We have to begin to think creatively, recognizing that not everybody wants to change the system. People all dream of a better life, but they don't necessarily all want the same thing. So we need to unite people to overcome the divisions which have been growing recent decades, and to be able to mobilize them successfully, and mobilize them not just to replace one set of leaders with another set of leaders, but rather to be able to bring about much more fundamental and deep-rooted transformations. And it is always a context-specific challenge. You cannot talk about it in the abstract.
If you had the power to change one thing tomorrow, what would it be?
I would begin with health and nutrition. Health and nutrition involves entire families. And I see the possibility in health and nutrition for greater leadership of women. And this, I think, is also important. So the transformation of social relations will also involve transformation in the household. Yeah, and this, I think, will be important. Part of the focus on nutrition is because many of the problems are not entirely systemic. Many of them have become, even if their origins are systemic, they've become part of our behavior. We are subjected to all kinds of propaganda from food companies, from beverage companies, and we have changed our lifestyles, and we are now suffering a lot of health and nutrition problems because of what we eat and drink, and this is a self-inflicted in some ways, or at least it appears to be so. So we need to begin to think about that and to address that. And if we are going to be serious about universal health coverage, it means that the price of medicines has to go down. Everybody should be able to afford decent health. As people deal with these problems, with health and nutrition issues, they begin to understand the subtle ways in which this system affects all of us. It's not only at the level of production, but also at the level of consumption. Perhaps this might be the way to go forward. And when you think about health, you also have to think about, for example, the consequences of global warming and how it affects us. And for example, when you think about sustainability, that there are different options involved. And all this becomes important when you think about nutrition, you think about food, and what you said earlier about producing for people's need. There's enough for people's needs, but not for everybody's greed. The satisfaction which is derived from just having a good meal, a good healthy meal, rather than very, very expensive and costly meals. So there are many issues which people become aware of. For example, the excessive use of agrochemicals to produce food. People become aware more as they become more aware of food and how that food affects their well-being, their health, their nutrition. Then I think this kind of awareness is very healthy for people to begin to understand how the system operates.
You mentioned you see the possibility for more leadership of women. Could you tell me more?
In many traditional households, the division of labor is such that the decisions about household consumption is still made by the women. So if you are able to enhance the power of the women there, traditionally we think in terms of production, but we also should think about consumption and reproduction. So for example, if you think about nutrition, the current scientific consensus is on the first 1,000 days. That means from the moment of an unborn child's conception until the child reaches the age of 2. The mother, the prospective mother, needs to be aware. So there are certain health considerations involved. The mother has to be aware, and the nutrition and health of the unborn child in terms of what the mother consumes, the interconnectedness of society, in this case between mother and child, but also the support system of the family and beyond, is something you begin to appreciate more in this kind of a context. So the household is just the nexus for these changing human relations, So when the decisions are being made which affect nutrition, affect health, and the decision making shifts, if we assume men bringing in money from the market, which is not the case. Many places it is the women who are working in the farm or women who are working in the market. But that power associated with bringing income has to be shared if you take a different view about health and nutrition. And of course, if you extend that to the greater appreciation of what now people call care work, that has important implications as well.
Who rules the world?
Well, I think there are different types of power. There's what is called economic power, there's political power, there is the power associated with the state, where even judges have some discretion. And then you also, in some societies, legislators have considerable influence because they set the rules of the game. And then you have soft power as well, this notion of soft power. So power doesn't just come from the barrel of the gun. It doesn't come from the repressive apparatus of the state, but it also comes from the powers of persuasion, of, for example, the cult of certain personalities. So there are different types of power, but I think given how things have changed in society, it is probably the power associated with wealth which is the most important, because many of the politicians, unfortunately, are available. Some people joke, we have the best election money can buy. And there's some truth to that. So, but again, it is the way power is shared and distributed in many societies changes, and it changes over time. And where individuals see themselves and in their relationship into power, a small farmer in a village, you to talk to them about the power of a big transnational corporation, it's very difficult for them to appreciate it, or the power of Google, or it's not easy to appreciate that. So this is the problem. You may have very, very powerful, rich people who are abusing their power and so on, but it is not self-evident to everybody that this is the case. And some of the people we may not like maybe are seen, if you have a big company offering goods at very low prices, they are making billions. But do we who go to those shops resent their existence? It's much more complex kind of situation which we live in, yes.
Do you have a dream?
I'm so tired from work that I hardly have a chance to dream. But of course, you want things to be better, But I don't think I spend much time dreaming a dream.
What is life about?
I would like to go with thinking that I have done something to make life better, especially for those who are marginalized. So, many people, because I live in Asia, they ask me why I'm still writing about African issues. Partly because of my names, I feel a connection, but also it is a way of reminding oneself that it's not just about ourselves. When we say we the people, it is not just we in the narrow sense of a we, but a broader sense.
You were named after two African anti-colonial leaders, but besides your background, what motivates you?
Partly because I have continued to do things without any success. So people often ask me, why bother? So it's not a very easy question to answer. But, from an early age, I guess I was quite happy to be innovative without necessarily being officially appreciated.
Perhaps it is the attitude you need to be a change maker. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Okay, Narina. All the best. Thank you.
This was the last interview of our mini-series about inequalities, but we are going to share more interviews on this topic soon. Thank you so much for listening, watching and sharing. Keep wondering and see you soon again. Bye and ciao.